Among the many wars that occurred in the past, there are a few that seem to be forgotten today. One of them is the War of 1812. Some historians and scholars believe this war was unnecessary, perhaps the reason for its lack of awareness today. But let's find out what caused and went on during the War of 1812. Hi there! Welcome to our channel, Eventful Insights. Today we'll continue to explore the remarkable and also seemingly forgotten wars of our history. In this video, we'll discover more about the War of 1812. Many people remain unknowledgeable about this part of world history, so together, let's get to know about the War of 1812. Before we begin, can we do a little survey? Have you ever heard of the War of 1812 before? Tell us in the comments below. Now let's begin. After achieving independence from Great Britain in the Revolutionary War, America endeavored to establish itself as an independent entity. Efforts were made to rebuild the military and navy, establish trade partnerships, and structure the government. Therefore, many Americans view the War of 1812 as a second fight for independence because it aimed to pressure the British into stopping actions that infringed upon American rights and challenged U.S. sovereignty. However, it's important to note that this war was part of a broader conflict occurring in Europe at the time. So first, we must understand what was happening during this time. The War of 1812, which occurred between June 18, 1812, and February 18, 1815, was a conflict between the United States, Great Britain, and Britain's Native American allies in North America. Following the American Revolution, relations between the U.S. and Britain were strained. Seeking victory, the U.S. had received help from France, Britain's long-standing rival. From the mid-1790s to the early 1800s, England and France engaged in a continuous struggle for dominance over Europe and their colonial empires, known as the Napoleonic Wars. This period of intense conflict, marked by conquests and counterattacks, was the largest armed confrontation in history up to that point. It represented the culmination of a long series of wars between England and France, including the Revolutionary War. Although the United States was not directly involved in the Napoleonic Wars, Americans experienced negative impacts, such as reduced trade raids and restrictions imposed by both England and France. So now let's get to know the order of events that eventually led to the war in 1812. On November 21, 1806, Napoleon initiated a shipping blockade known as the Berlin Decree, aiming to weaken British trade. He closed European ports under his control to British vessels and declared that neutral and French ships would be confiscated if they visited a British port before reaching a continental port, forming the Continental System. In response, Great Britain issued a series of orders in council mandating that neutral ships obtain a license before sailing to Europe. With Lord Nelson's victory at Trafalgar in October 1805, Great Britain had the naval power to enforce its blockade against France. Meanwhile, the United States had long grappled with the challenges of remaining neutral in the European conflict. Tensions escalated as the British began intercepting American ships trading in Europe. In 1807, tensions at sea reached a boiling point near Chesapeake Bay. While a British naval squadron patrolled the area for French ships, several British sailors deserted and joined the American Navy. When the captain of the American frigate Chesapeake refused to allow the British ship HMS Leopard to board and search his vessel, the Leopard opened fire, killing 3 crew members and injuring 18 others. 4 men were seized by the British during the incident, known as the Chesapeake Affair, which deeply outraged Americans. Then, Great Britain implemented a ban on trade between France, its allies, and the Americas. In retaliation, Congress passed an embargo act prohibiting U.S. vessels from trading with European nations. Later, the Non-Intercourse Act specifically targeted France and Britain. However, these measures proved ineffective. By 1810, the United States reopened trade with France and Great Britain under the condition that they lift their blockades against neutral trading. Despite this agreement, Great Britain continued to intercept American merchant ships, searching American vessels for goods deemed illegal and hunting for deserters from the Royal Navy. Despite American citizenship certificates, British authorities disregarded them, and some British captains attempted to impress native-born Americans into service on British ships. They also enforced their blockade of neutral commerce. Furthermore, Britain allied with Native American tribes in the Northwest Territory, led by Shawnee figures like Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh, to oppose U.S. expansion. This alliance aimed to halt westward U.S. expansion and safeguard British interests in Canada, while some branches of alliances, like the Iroquois Confederacy, sided with American forces. Most strategically aligned themselves with Great Britain. This decision was driven by the perception that the British were more inclined to respect traditional territories and trade, making them the preferred colonial ally. On May 1st, 1811, officers from the British ship HMS Gearia impressed an American sailor from a coastal vessel, further escalating tensions. Diplomatic resolution of these maritime disputes was possible, especially considering that the new British government under Lord Liverpool revoked the Orders in Council a few days before the US declared war. However, this news didn't reach America in time. Additionally, not all Americans desired war with Great Britain, particularly merchants in New England and New York. With only 16 warships at its disposal, the United States faced a significant imbalance compared to the Royal Navy, which boasted around 500 ships in service by 1812. Meanwhile, President James Madison was swayed by Major General Henry Dearborn's analysis, suggesting that Canada would be easily conquered in the event of war, even suggesting that Canadians would welcome invasion. Consequently, the young nation turned its attention to Canada, viewing the conquest of British territory as a strategic move to gain leverage in maritime disputes. Many Americans, influenced by former President Jefferson's belief that capturing Canada would be simple, anticipated a swift victory. With a population advantage of 7.7 million to Canada's 500,000, it was widely assumed that U.S. troops would be welcomed as liberators. However, reality did not align with these expectations. Conducting warfare across vast distances in the North American wilderness, with stretched supply lines, proved to be a formidable challenge. The British, along with their indigenous allies in North America, presented a resilient and determined opposition. Furthermore, a group of congressmen known as the War Hawks, predominantly from the southern and western states, fervently called for war, motivated by anti-British sentiment and nationalism. These Republicans advocated for war to retaliate against Britain for the economic hardships caused by the blockade and for what they perceived as British support for Native American resistance to American westward expansion. By 1812, they had garnered the backing of President James Madison. Notably, Henry Clay of Kentucky, a prominent figure in this group known as the War Hawks, persuaded President Madison to sign a declaration of war against Britain on June 18, 1812. As American leaders strategized their invasion of Canada, they quickly identified Upper Canada as the most susceptible target. The maritime provinces were shielded by British naval dominance, while Lower Canada benefited from its remote location and the formidable defense of Quebec City. In contrast, Upper Canada appeared relatively undefended and accessible. Upper Canada's defence relied primarily on approximately 1,600 British regular troops, mainly from the 41st Regiment of Foot and supplemented by militia units. Despite being outnumbered, the British forces were more prepared than the Americans realised. Major General Sir Isaac Brock, the administrator of Upper Canada, had exhibited foresight and thorough planning for the impending conflict over the past 5 years. He bolstered fortifications, trained militia forces, and crucially cultivated alliances with indigenous nations. Brock's preparations included reinforcing the 41st Regiment with militia units, although their loyalty was uncertain. Additionally, control of Lake Ontario was secured by the Provincial Marine. Brock's understanding of the impending challenges and his proactive measures significantly enhanced Upper Canada's defense against potential American invasion. Why don't we take a quick break first? Those were sure a lot of names and dates, so why don't you tell us your thoughts in the comments below before we continue? If you're interested in watching more videos about our history and intriguing mysteries, you may want to check out our channel. Sir Isaac Brock, despite facing limited resources with only around 1,600 regular troops in the province, refused to remain passive in the face of the American threat. Believing that a bold military action would rally the population and garner support from First Nations, he ordered the capture of Michilimackinac Island on July 17th, a key American post. The term First Nations is specifically applied to Indigenous peoples in present-day Canada, while Native Americans refers to Indigenous peoples in the United States. With the assistance of Indigenous warriors and a small British force, the fort was swiftly captured without bloodshed. Meanwhile, General William Hull's American force had crossed into Canada from Detroit, prompting Brock to hastily march his men from York to counter the invasion. Upon arriving at Amherstburg, Brock found that the American forces had withdrawn to Detroit. With the support of Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, Brock demanded Hull's surrender, which was granted on August 16th, effectively giving the British control of Michigan Territory and the upper Mississippi. However, the American losses continued as they were defeated at Queenston Heights on October 13, 1812, after militia troops refused to cross into Canada. During this engagement, Brock was killed, marking a significant loss for the British and Canadian forces. Despite attempts by a new American army under William Henry Harrison to retake Detroit, the British strategy shifted to a defensive stance following Brock's death. Governor Sir George Prevost opted to conserve his limited forces, maintaining a strong garrison at Quebec and reinforcing Upper Canada only when additional troops arrived from overseas. Tecumseh was killed, and Native American opposition was decisively crushed. However, in the Eastern Theater, American forces struggled to make significant progress. As the campaign of 1813 began, an American flotilla of 16 ships landed at York, now known as Toronto, the capital of Upper Canada. The Americans briefly occupied the town, burning public buildings and seizing valuable naval supplies intended for Lake Erie. However, the British thwarted the American plan to appropriate a half-completed warship by burning it instead. If successful, the Americans might have gained greater control over Lake Ontario. Nevertheless, neither side completely controlled the lake for the remainder of the war. The Americans soon abandoned York, and on May 27, 1813, their fleet seized Fort George at the mouth of the Niagara River. Despite this being a challenging period for the British, the military situation was not irrecoverable. The Americans failed to capitalize on their success, neglecting to immediately pursue General John Vincent and his retreating army from Fort George to Burlington Heights. It wasn't until June 2nd that the American forces set out from Fort George, allowing the British time to regroup and prepare. On the night of June 5, 1813, Vincent's men launched a surprise attack on the American forces at Stony Creek. In a fierce battle, the British dislodged the Americans, capturing 2 of their generals. Following this defeat, the demoralized American force retreated towards Niagara. 3 weeks later, at Beaver Dams, approximately 600 American soldiers were captured by a smaller force of 300 Kanawake and 100 Mohawk warriors led by Captain William Kerr. The British were alerted to the American attack by Laura Secord. a loyalist whose husband had been wounded at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Ultimately, worn down by sickness, desertion, and the departure of short-term soldiers, the American command evacuated Fort George on December 10th and withdrew from Canada. Upon leaving, the militia burned the town of Newark, prompting brutal retaliation from the British in Buffalo. These retaliatory actions continued until Washington itself was burned by the British the following August. On the Western Front, the Americans experienced success against the British. The British attempted but failed to capture William Henry Harrison's stronghold at Fort Meigs on the Maumee River. A struggle ensued for control of Lake Erie, with the two rival fleets meeting on September 10, 1813, at Put-in Bay. Hindered by the American seizure of naval supplies at York earlier in the year and the loss of several senior officers early in the battle, the British fleet faced defeat. American Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, known for his boldness, employed unconventional tactics to turn the tide and become the first person in history to capture an entire British fleet. This victory granted the Americans dominance over the upper Great Lakes, effectively making Lake Erie an American-controlled body of water. In response, the British Army abandoned Detroit and retreated up the Thames River. At the Battle of the Thames, the exhausted British regulars and First Nations warriors were routed, resulting in the death of Tecumseh and the scattering of the British forces. While the defeat did not spell the end for the province, as Harrison couldn't capitalize on his victory due to the urgency of his soldiers returning to their farms for harvest, it effectively ended the alliance with the First Nations. Meanwhile, the events unfolding in Europe had a significant impact on the course of the war. With Napoleon's abdication in April 1814, the British could redirect more of their resources towards the conflict with the United States. Additionally, the conclusion of the European War rendered some of President James Madison's demands, such as the return of neutral shipping rights and the immediate cessation of impressment, irrelevant. As the British were no longer engaged in conflict with France, these practices were abandoned before the end of the war with the United States. In the meantime, in Lake Huron, American forces searched for British supply vessels, resulting in the sinking of the Nancy. They also raised Sault Ste. Marie on July 21, 1814, and attempted to recapture Fort Michilimackinac. However, the British regained a presence on the lake in early September with the capture of the Tigress and Scorpion. Additionally, American forces invaded Lower Canada during the war. Despite outnumbering the British 10-1, the American armies, led by Generals James Wilkinson and Wade Hampton, were poorly led. They faced resistance from a mixed force of British regulars, voltigeurs, militia, and First Nations fighters. Then, the Americans once again invaded Upper Canada, crossing the Niagara River at Buffalo. They quickly seized Fort Erie on July 3rd, and on July 5th repelled a hasty attack by the British under General Phineas Riall at Chippewa. The climax of the Niagara campaign occurred with the bloodiest battle of the war, Lundy's Lane, on July 25th. Fought in the pitch dark of a humid night by exhausted troops, unable to discern friend from foe, the battle ended in a stalemate. With the American invasion effectively exhausted, they withdrew to Fort Erie. There, they inflicted heavy casualties on the forces of the new British commander, Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond. During a failed night attack on August 14 to 15, 1814, the Battle of Bladensburg in August 1814 marked a significant moment for the British troops. Following their victory at the Battle of Bladensburg, British troops entered Washington, D.C. and set fire to multiple government buildings, including the Capitol and the White House. Commodore Thomas Tingey, in charge of the Washington Navy Yard, saw smoke rising from the Capitol and ordered the yard to be burned to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. In 1814, the most significant British effort was the invasion of northern New York, where Governor Sir George Prevost led 11,000 British veterans of the Napoleonic Wars to Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain. However, Prevost's hesitance to attack, coupled with the defeat of the British fleet in Plattsburgh Bay by American Commodore Thomas Macdonough on September 11th, led Prevost to withdraw his troops. Prevost's decision to withdraw from American territory impacted peace negotiations in Ghent, Belgium, which began in August 1814. His withdrawal forced British peace negotiators to lower their demands and accept the status quo. When the treaty was signed on Christmas Eve 1814, all conquests were to be restored and boundary disputes were deferred to joint commissions. Despite a decisive victory by a U.S. Navy squadron over a British flotilla on Lake Champlain during the Battle of Plattsburgh from September 6 to 10, 1814, America's situation remained uncertain. The British then turned their attention to the important seaport of Baltimore, Maryland, the third largest American city at the time. Beginning on September 13, 1814, British warships bombarded Fort McHenry for 25 hours. However, facing determined resistance from U.S. forces, British warships began withdrawing from Chesapeake Bay the following day. Meanwhile, peace negotiations, initiated in August, continued at Ghent. On December 24, 1814, delegates from both countries signed the Treaty of Ghent, which was later ratified by the U.S. Senate in February 1815. The treaty resulted in neither Great Britain nor the United States losing any territory or surrendering any rights. Indigenous nations, many of which had aligned with the British, were unable to regain any lost territories and continued to face further land loss to westward expanding settlers. Great Britain made no concessions on maritime issues and retained control of Canada. However, the United States affirmed its sovereignty and earned international respect for having fought the powerful British Empire to a strategic standstill. Due to slow communication, word of the treaty's signing was delayed in reaching North America. Consequently, several land battles, including the Battle of New Orleans in January, occurred after the treaty had been signed. The war's final naval engagement, the capture of a British merchant vessel by the USS Peacock off Java, took place as late as June 30th. Following this, a 3-month standoff ensued, culminating in the Americans withdrawing across the Niagara River on November 5th, effectively ending the war in Upper Canada. On the Atlantic front, Lieutenant Governor Sir John Sherbrooke led a force from Halifax into Maine, capturing Castine on September 1st, 1814. By mid-September, British forces held much of the Maine coast, which was returned to the U.S. only upon the signing of the peace treaty in December 1814. Despite the signing of the peace treaty, hostilities continued. The last battle of the war, often cited as the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815, saw British and American forces clash at Fort Bowyer on Mobile Bay on February 11, 1815. Several naval engagements followed, including the final battle between the USS sloop Peacock and the East India cruiser Nautilus in the Indian Ocean 4.5 months after the signing of the peace treaty. The War of 1812 played a significant role in shaping Canada's identity and territorial boundaries. The negotiations that followed the peace treaty contributed to defining Canada's present shape. Moreover, the war and the myths surrounding it fostered a sense of community among Canadians, laying the groundwork for their future nationhood. In this sense, some people consider the Canadians as the true winners of the War of 1812, as it helped solidify their collective identity and set the stage for their development as a nation. Meanwhile, the outcome was more ambiguous for the Americans. Although some issues remained unresolved in the peace treaty, the war showcased the future potential of American power with spectacular victories at sea. However, It proved a failure for the war hawks, who aimed to annex Canada, and its true significance in terms of independence or honor remains debatable. The war's losers included Tecumseh's Confederacy and the Creek Nation, whose defeat effectively halted their efforts to resist American expansion, while the Canadians fared better in preserving their land and culture. The British ultimately abandoned their indigenous allies in the peace negotiations. On the other hand, the War of 1812 had devastating consequences for American Indians. In March 1814, General Andrew Jackson dealt a severe blow to the Creek Nation's military strength in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, fought in the Mississippi Territory. Jackson aimed to clear the territory for American settlement, resulting in the deaths of approximately 15% of the entire Creek population. The subsequent Treaty of Fort Jackson compelled the Creeks to surrender 23 million acres of land and pledge never to ally with the British or Spanish against the Americans. The victory of the United States and the death of Tecumseh in battle spelled the end of any hope for a Native American alliance system or confederation. Furthermore, the British effectively abandoned their Native American allies. With little protection from the British and minimal tribal unity, Native Americans faced further defeats as the United States expanded westward. Andrew Jackson, previously a relatively unknown figure, rose to national hero status following his success at the Battle of New Orleans. This victory occurred after the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, but before the news reached New Orleans. As President, Jackson would oversee the continued removal, relocation, and oppression of Native Americans and their traditional way of life. And that's it. That is the War of 1812. Now that you know more about this war, do you also share the same thoughts with other historians and scholars that this war seems unnecessary? Share with us your opinions in the comments below. If you enjoyed watching this video, you can support us by giving it a like, subscribing to our channel, and ringing the notification bell. Thanks for watching.